It's one of the most densely populated places on Earth and one of the most impoverished. Living here means unsafe drinking water, few jobs, even fewer basic necessities, and almost no chance of leaving. I'm Imran Garta, and today on the Newsmakers, we look at whether the Gaza Strip has become unlivable. 6,000 people are packed into every single one of the Gaza Strip's 365 square kilometers. They live under a crippling blockade and a sky from which mortars and bombs rain down. It is a difficult life in a besieged territory, a narrow piece of land where people have long been short on hope and are almost entirely reliant on the outside world for their survival. Haider Abbasi traveled to the Gaza Strip to find out if the people living there have reached the point of no return.
Winter can't keep them away. The beach offers the people here a brief respite. But no one can outrun the reality of life in Gaza. The territory is one of the most impoverished places on Earth, and it's only getting worse. In 2012, the United Nations predicted Gaza would be unlivable by 2020. Was the UN right? Ahmed Al-Hissi is a refugee in Al-Shati camp in Gaza City. She lives with 6 members of her family in just one room.
ثاني هذه السنة بحياتي هذه بقول أنا لبناتي هم موجودين والله يما عشت اللي عشته هاي زي 86 سنة هلقيت عمري أنا ما شفتش أسوأ من هالسنة اللي جت علينا.
Most of Gaza's 2 million people are refugees who rely on food aid, but Ahmed says she doesn't receive anything.
مش حدا بيجيب لي أي حاجة ولا مساعدة ولا واحد بدق داري وبيجي رمضان وبروح السنة وبتيجي السنة بصير أكلم بحالي بقول له أنا مش أنا بعيد عنك حيوان بفهمش أنا الحيوان بيجيبوه كل وجبه بوجبته بطعموه لكن أنا ما حد بدور علي يما لو ما كنتش أنا معاي فلوس اللي تصرف على نفسي بسألش على حدا لكن لما يكون ما فيش معاك وين بدك تروح أنا ست كبيرة أقعد على الباب أمد إيدي عيب علي.
Life for Palestinians in Gaza has become unbearable, growing steadily worse since Israel and Egypt blockaded the territory in 2007. Israel says the siege is necessary for security reasons, but the UN calls it collective punishment. There are severe restrictions on who and what can enter or leave the Strip.
In the early years of the siege on Gaza, Israel worked out the minimum number of calories people here needed in order to survive. One former advisor to the Israeli government is quoted as saying, "The idea is to put the Palestinians on a diet, but not to make them die of hunger."
Adnan Abu Husna is the media advisor for the United Nations Relief Works Agency. Most Gazans rely on UNRWA for their daily needs, from food to healthcare and education.
The blockade is the main challenge that UNRWA is facing. I'll give you one example that in 2000, number of beneficiaries who used to receive food aid from UNRWA, it was about 80,000. Now you are talking about 1.1 million. Why that happened? Because of the blockade, because of the great destruction of the private sector, the main employer for Palestinians.
Before the blockade, thousands of Palestinians from Gaza worked in Israel, but that ended when the siege began. Now more than 50% of the population is out of work. Mohammed Massoud's son, Bilal, was shot by an Israeli sniper while taking part in the Great March of Return protests last year. After being bedridden by the injury, he became depressed and took his own life.
الوضع مأساوي في غزة، وضع صعب جدا. طبعا ممكن. بطالة فيش شغل فيش شباب قاعدة ما فيش في جيبة الواحد شيكل. وضع اقتصادي سيء.
Even the water in Gaza is dangerous. 97% of it here is not safe for human consumption. Families are forced to buy expensive bottled water or rely on aid agencies.
والله المي ما بتكفيني في اليوم. أنا المي هذه بتجيني في أسبوع تقريبا مرة واحدة اللي هو يوم الأربعاء، وباخذ حصة أقل من القليل من المي، لا بتكفيني أغسل أولادي ولا أحمم أولادي ولا حتى أشرب من المي، لأن المي عندي يعني معدومة تماما. ولما ما لاقيش المية الحلوة اللي أشرب منها وأشرب أولادي منها بضطر إني أشربهم مية مالحة سببت لهم الأمراض، وهذه المية منها جراثيم ومنها كمان فيها بتسبب مرض الحصوة.
Almost a quarter of sickness in Gaza is caused by waterborne diseases. Dr. Ahmed Al-Hillas is a groundwater expert and says this is an environmental disaster.
We produce now in the Gaza Strip more than 2,200 tons of solid waste every day. So you can imagine how many or how much or how much amount of this toxic material which by way or another can reach your groundwater aquifer and contaminate your soil.
The UN says the prediction they made about Gaza in 2012 became a reality years ago. Palestinians here can only wonder if they can begin to live again. Haider Abbasi, The Newsmakers, Gaza.
Well, to discuss those UN predictions, let's go to our guest. Joining me now from West Jerusalem is Efraim Inbar. He's the president of the Jerusalem Institute for Strategy and Security. Mustafa Barghouti joins us from Ramallah. He's the Secretary General of the Palestinian National Initiative and a member of the Palestinian Legislative Council. And in Washington, D.C. is the former USAID assistant for the West Bank and Gaza, Dave Harden. Good to have you all on the program. Dave Harden, let me begin with you. That UN report in 2012 said Gaza would be unlivable by 2020. We're in 2020. Do you believe that Gaza, given all the metrics available, do you believe that it has become unlivable for Palestinians there?
Well, it's an interesting question. I think actually Gaza is hopeless. I think there's an enduring hopelessness, but by definition, people are living there. And so, you know, they, despite the challenges of their life, they are actually living there. But I would say that the better descriptor is hopelessness.
Okay, people are suffering. I think we can all agree on that. Efraim Inbar, is Israel the one party here, given that it enforces the blockade and the siege, the one party here that is most responsible for their suffering? Can you accept that?
Of course not. I think the Gazans are basically responsible for their own situation, and because your reportage ignored the political fact that Hamas since 2007 has been ruled by Hamas, a murderous terrorist organization that is fighting Israel. The situation is a result of their pouring thousands of missiles, making the life of hundreds of thousands of Israelis miserable. And they are our enemy, and we treat them as such. But I don't remember
okay. No, but you're talking
United
about
States
okay, you're talking about Hamas.
Pouring food to Germany during World War II.
Okay, this is interesting. So you're comparing the Gaza Strip to the Nazis. But what's interesting here is that wouldn't you accept that if you're the landlord here, right, and you've cut electricity, you've cut water, you've sealed all the entrances and exits, and you're still pointing out the fact that there's a man in the apartment that beats his children, that doesn't make it untrue, but you're fundamentally responsible for the building, aren't you?
We are not responsible for Gaza. Israel left Gaza in 2005, and they are responsible for their destiny.
So why don't
we
you
are
leave,
not responsible
okay, so why don't
for
you leave the
people
border,
beyond our borders.
Okay, so why don't you leave the airspace
Gaza is beyond
and the sea
Israel's
space?
border.
Why doesn't Israel leave the airspace and the sea space and just let them be then?
Because we don't want Gaza to use the airspace against Israel. They're actually using it. They are sending missiles via their airspace. Right. They are sending many vehicles, balloons against Israeli civilians. So we definitely want to control their airspace as well as the sea, because they try to smuggle weapons, missiles into Gaza in order to fight Israel.
Professor
They are,
Inbar,
they are fighting a war against Israel.
Okay, I'm going to get a response
and
in a
they,
moment.
as a
Okay.
result, suffer.
Professor Inbar, I want to ask if you have any sympathy for the 2 million Palestinians living in the Gaza Strip, a lot of whom are suffering, many of whom don't support Hamas. Do you have any sympathy for them?
Of course, I have a sympathy for poor people that their leaders put them in such a terrible situation. But in throughout the world, the simple people are suffering because of their leadership. It's not that different from other places of the world.
Mustafa Barghouti.
Well, as usual, every Israeli that you will introduce will start blaming the Palestinians and trying to blame the victims for the crimes that Israel is committing against them. Let me give you the facts. First of all, Israel never left Gaza. It did not end its occupation to Gaza. Israel still controls all passages to Gaza except for Rafah crossing, which is very limited. Israel controls the airspace of Gaza. Israel controls the sea of Gaza. Israel controls how many miles fishermen can go into the sea or not. Israel even imposes inside Gaza by gunfire a buffer zone that is consuming no less than 24% of the size of Gaza. That area that is only 360 square kilometers with 2 million people living there. Who are these 2 million people? 70% of them are people who were displaced by Israel from their towns and villages in 1948. They are Palestinian refugees who were punished by Israel, evicted by Israel, and Israel practiced ethnic cleansing against them, and now it is attacking them. He speaks about rockets, but these are why rockets are shot? In response to Israeli attacks. And let me tell you that during the last 6 years, Israel conducted 3 wars on Gaza. Israel killed during these wars no less than 4,200 Palestinians. For people to understand what that means, it's more than what coronavirus has killed so far. That is by Israeli gunfire, by Israeli. How many Israelis were killed? About 80. Compare it. 4,200 to 80. I don't want any Israeli or Palestinian be killed, but what Israel is doing is a big humanitarian crime. At this moment, because of Israeli closure, 95% of water in Gaza is either polluted or salted. Israel has exhausted the aquifer in Gaza. Israel is depriving Gaza from the natural flow of water from the mountains of the Hebron area. Israel is forbidding Gaza from having normal amount of electricity, and that's why nobody can treat the sewage systems, and that's why sewage flows into the streets of Gaza, bringing back many infectious diseases that we have already eliminated through our health system.
Okay, Mustafa.
And Israel, West Bank and Gaza are both one entity, Palestinian state.
You say that
which
they are
Israel
one
occupies,
entity.
and Israel is still occupying West Bank.
Certainly, you say that, right? But for the past
please.
14 years, we know that Gaza needs peace, it needs justice, it needs development. But for the past 14 years, the Palestinian leadership can't even bring itself to the point where it can find agreement between the West Bank and Gaza, whether it's between Hamas and the PA or whatever it is, right? There are overtures in Moscow right now. They're trying, but they've failed. Why should the Israelis care if the Palestinians can't even come together and say we're unified on this issue?
This is not Israel's business, for sure, but why Israel continues to occupy us? By which law? Why we in the West Bank are still occupied by Israel, and more than that, Israel now wants to annex more than 60% of the West Bank, including the Jordan Valley and the Israeli illegal settlements. Why Israel continues to violate international law every day? The internal division is our problem, and Fatah and Hamas are responsible for it, for sure. And we are working on resolving it. I just came back from Moscow, where we are trying to conduct negotiations to end this internal division. But that by no means justifies the fact that Israel is occupying us since 52 years, long time before there was Hamas even, a long time before there was rockets in Gaza. Israel has been occupying us for 52 years. It has displaced us since 72 years, and Israel is responsible for that. They cannot escape the fact. He is trying to compare Palestinians with Nazis.
Okay, so
I
let me
think
then
that what
ask,
Israel is doing
let's
is
ask Efraim
state terrorism
Inbar.
in the worst fascist manner.
Efraim Inbar, if you were a Palestinian in Gaza, they haven't had an election for a long time, so you can't vote out Hamas. Hamas is in control. What would you do if you were a Palestinian in Gaza and you were subjected to this sort of suffering? If you were besieged and if you were controlled at the borders by the Israelis, by the Egyptians, and so on, what would you do?
Try to get away from Hamas.
You can't get out of Gaza.
I would try to get away as quickly as possible.
Israel
from
forbids
Hamas
people
rule.
from leaving.
By the way, that's not exactly correct. There is actually, from what I know, may I continue?
Go ahead, Professor Inbar.
This is not exactly correct. There is a small number of Gazans that are leaving Gaza, primarily via Egypt. There is actually a Gazan colony in Athens, and which testifies to the quality of government in this part of the world. Yeah, it is a tragic situation which Hamas is responsible for. And I would be very happy if the Arab world would put an end to this rule. But what we see actually is that Qatar, as well as Turkey, are helping Hamas to continue to rule over Gaza. And this is the root
Professor
problem
Inbar, by what?
of Gaza now.
Okay, but by bringing development and building hospitals in Gaza, how are you helping Hamas? Should you rather just let people suffer?
Because it makes their rule more bearable. And actually, Israel is not against improving the human conditions in Gaza. We are supplying water, we are supplying electricity, we are supplying food. But Hamas is basically using those to promote their own rule, which is, as I said, the main reason for the suffering of the Gazans. This is, by the way, accepted by the whole international community.
I want to go back to Dave Harden. Hold on. It's not ruled. Hold on. I want to go back to Dave Harden here as we circle back, because we've looked at the multiple players involved here, right? Dave Harden, it's clear that there's been a problem for a long time, and it's clear that these people are at the mercy of big geopolitical factors here at play. Big powers, the Israeli occupation, the Egyptians, Hamas, the Palestinian struggle, and infighting, the United States, and so on. At the moment, what do you actually do, given all of these problems? What do you do to make Gaza more livable for the people there and to make their lives better? Or is it impossible unless there's a major political change?
So let me begin by just noting that your viewers must be exhausted of listening to the narratives of each side. And each side kind of trots out their talking points, but they don't have any self-reflection. They're not thinking through where they may be responsible. So let's just break this apart for a second. Hamas is in charge. Hamas is a authoritarian regime that exercises full control over the political, economic, and social structures inside Gaza. So they chose to be the leaders. They chose to exercise full responsibility, and they need to be held accountable. At the same time, Israel has a shared destiny with 2 million people that are living in a state of hopelessness and grievances. And that can't be healthy for anybody. It can't be healthy for the Palestinians in Gaza, of course, but it's also not good for the Israelis or for the world writ large. And we need to get beyond kind of the backward-looking talking points that everyone keeps trotting out in these interviews and figure out concrete ways to restore hope, and some kind of future and destiny for the 2 million people that are in Gaza. So there's loads of things that Israel could do today that would advance Palestinian interests, but also help secure their future as well. And none of this is being discussed.
But Dave, okay, so Dave, and I don't want to answer for both the other guests, but the Palestinians would say, okay, that's great, but stop the siege first and then we can talk. And the Israelis would say, that's great, but stop the rockets first, right? So how do you actually have that conversation, Dave?
So I think what you don't do is have that conversation. I think what you do is begin small steps kind of across the board that would relieve the stress and the pressure in Gaza. So I would begin, for instance, by opening up more than one crossing in Kerem Shalom. I would kind of create a sense of redundancy so that people and goods can move in a much more systematic way across the board. I would work with Egypt to get more predictability and certainty out of Rafah. I would begin to actually kind of revise how UNRWA operates so that it's not just handing baskets of food to poor people, because there's no dignity in that. I would try to kind of re-engineer the textile trade that Gaza used to have when they traded with Israel and the world, and same with high-value agriculture, and same with technology. So there's a number of things that could happen today.
Okay, so you have a laundry list of things practically that you would do on the ground. Mustafa Barghouti, are you partial to any of that?
Well, I think the major issue here is why Israel continues to occupy Gaza and the West Bank. As long as there is occupation, we will have a lot of suffering, and this is not good for both people. But let me say that they say that Israel provides some electricity. Israel gets paid for that. But it is how much electricity people get in Gaza, 6 hours a day. Imagine, can you live with only 6 hours a day of electricity? Imagine that you cannot, can you live with this very scarce amount of water? Israel has made Gaza the largest prison in the world. It's an open-air prison where people are clustered, where people are practically treated as Jewish people were treated in ghettos in Europe. That is unacceptable, inhuman. What we want is freedom. What we want is free access to the world. Israel should leave us alone so that we can build our future, so that we can be free, so that we can build our economy, so that we can have democracy. If we speak about internal division, let me remind you that I personally mediated between Fatah and Hamas in 2006, and I managed to convince both of them to form a national unity government in 2007. What happened then? Israel boycotted us. Israel withheld our own tax revenue, which unfortunately comes through them, and they take commission for that. They withheld our tax revenue. They dragged us practically into division. And now Israel wants this division to continue so that they can use it as an excuse against any possibility of negotiations with Palestinian leaders, claiming that there is no leader that can represent all Palestinians.
Okay.
In my opinion, the root problem here, of course, it's a humanitarian problem. Of course, it's a disaster when you lose 4,200 people in Israeli attacks. But the main root problem is that Israel continues to oppress another people, and it has transformed occupation into a system of the worst kind of apartheid, much worse than what prevailed in South Africa.
Efraim Inbar, are you okay with the status quo? Keep them besieged. If there's rocket fire, bombard them or invade them again and just keep them under control, and that's that. That's the status quo. Is that sustainable for you?
Of course it's not acceptable. I don't want my people along the Gaza border to suffer. The question, what can I do? We have no interest in hungry neighbors. At the same time, why should Israelis pay to an entity that is at war with us? Gaza is at war with Israel. It is their initiative. What we want is quiet. If there will be quiet, we'll be able to help.
Israel's initiative,
we are helping
because you are occupying
many
us.
people
You are
throughout the world,
occupying
and
us
we
with
are not,
military force.
We are.
You are occupying us with
forget
military
about
force.
occupation.
You are the
Pick
ones
up
who are
another
occupying
slogan.
us. Yeah.
You are
this
interrupting me,
this
which
is
is
the
not very
reality
polite.
I live in. Your army is here. Your army oppresses me. Your army builds illegal settlements in my land. Your army puts us in prison. Your army is forbidding me from having normal life. What are you talking about? If you are blind not to see the fact that we are under occupation, then there is no use of talking to you.
I'm talking about terrorism.
What terrorism? You are practicing
when
state
the Palestinians
terror.
will
I
stop
told you
terrorist
killed
activities,
4,200 Palestinians in Gaza.
They will be quiet.
Okay, gentlemen.
You killed 4,200 Palestinians in Gaza.
I've got
You
30
are
seconds left on the
imprisoning
show.
more than
I'm not
5,000
here
Palestinians
in
today
for
in
a
prison.
shouting game.
Okay, gentlemen.
For
I've got
a
30
shouting
seconds left.
match.
I've got 30 seconds left on the program. Mustafa Barghouti, Efraim Inbar, and Dave Harden. Worth noting, at the moment, Gaza's unemployment at almost 50%, youth unemployment at over 60%. As was mentioned, electricity cuts all the time, lack of water, lack of opportunity, and many can't leave. Thank you very much for joining us, gentlemen. Pleasure having you on the program. And thank you for watching. We will, no doubt, see you next time. Bye-bye.